The officer hasn't searched your car. He hasn't accused you of anything serious. Up to this point, the traffic stop feels uncomfortable, but manageable. Then he steps back slightly, looks toward his patrol car, and says something that changes the entire atmosphere in seconds. I'm calling a K9 unit, and right there, before the dog ever arrives, before another officer pulls up, before anything else happens, most drivers make the mistake that actually turns the stop against them. Not because they had something illegal, not because they were dangerous, but because fear took control of their mouth before logic had a chance to catch up. So, let me ask you something. If an officer suddenly mentioned a K9 during your traffic stop, would you stay calm and know exactly what to say? Or would panic start making decisions for you? Answer honestly in the comments, because the psychological pressure behind that one sentence is far more powerful than most people realize. And in a few minutes, you'll understand why experienced defense attorneys pay close attention to what drivers say immediately after hearing the word K9. Here's what makes this situation dangerous. The average driver hears, "I'm calling a K9," and instantly assumes one thing. The officer already knows something. That assumption alone changes behavior. Breathing changes, movements change, tone changes, decision-making changes, and officers are trained to notice behavioral shifts under pressure. That's the part people misunderstand. The K9 isn't always the first test. Sometimes your reaction to hearing about the K9 is, picture this. A man gets stopped driving home after midnight. He was slightly speeding, nothing dramatic, music low, window cracked, normal interaction at first. The officer asks basic questions. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? Whose car is this? The driver answers quickly, trying hard to sound relaxed. But then the officer pauses for a second and says, "Just sit tight. I'm going to call a K9. Now watch how fast psychology takes over. The driver immediately starts talking more than before. There's nothing in the car. I don't even smoke. My cousin used this car earlier. You can search it if you want." And just like that, the entire stop changes direction. Not because evidence appeared, because panic did. People think pressure exposes guilt. A lot of the time, it exposes fear. And fear makes innocent people behave strangely every single day. That's why experienced officers watch reactions carefully after mentioning a dog unit. Some drivers suddenly avoid eye contact. Some become aggressive. Some start over explaining details nobody requested. Some start moving around inside the car. And those reactions create more suspicion than silence ever would. Now here's where smart drivers separate themselves from emotional ones. The goal is not to win the stop. The goal is to stop yourself from feeding it. Big difference. Most drivers don't realize how often they accidentally expand an investigation with their own words. The officer mentions a K9, and suddenly the driver begins volunteering information like they're being interrogated in court. That's a mistake, because once you start talking under stress, your brain starts prioritizing escape, not precision. That's why people contradict themselves. That's why they ramble. That's why tiny harmless details suddenly sound suspicious. Stress changes speech patterns, and officers know that. Now, here's the sentence that matters. If an officer says they're calling a K9, calmly say, "I do not consent to any searches." That's it. No speeches, no arguing, no fake legal lecture from social media. Just one calm sentence. And the reason this works is because it keeps you controlled while clearly protecting your position. Notice something important here. You are not resisting. You are not yelling. You are not escalating. You are simply refusing consent calmly and clearly. That matters more than people think, because emotional resistance usually creates emotional escalation. Calm clarity does the opposite. Now, let's talk about the mistake that destroys people during these moments: talking too much. The silence after "I'm calling a K9" makes drivers uncomfortable. Human beings naturally want to fill uncomfortable silence, so they start explaining. That's where disaster begins. One driver says, "There's probably an old beer can somewhere." Now alcohol enters the situation. Another says, "My friend had weed in here weeks ago." Now drugs enter the situation. Another laughs nervously and says, "You're not going to find a body in the trunk." People joke themselves into deeper investigations constantly, and what's scary is they often think they're helping themselves. But roadside conversations are different under pressure. Words don't disappear once spoken, and nervous humor sounds very different during a police stop than it does at a dinner table. Now, here's something even more important. A K9 mention changes the timeline of the stop psychologically. The driver stops thinking about the original reason for being pulled over and starts thinking about survival. That mental shift is where mistakes multiply. Because once survival mode activates, people stop behaving naturally. They start performing innocence instead of simply remaining calm. And forced innocence looks strange. That's why officers pay attention to sudden personality shifts. Calm person becomes hyper-talkative. Confident person becomes shaky. Quiet person suddenly starts oversharing. Pressure reveals behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes more than most drivers realize. Now, let's clear up another dangerous myth. Refusing consent does not magically stop everything. That's internet fantasy. If officers believe they legally have probable cause, procedures may continue anyway, depending on the situation and jurisdiction. But your refusal still matters, a lot. Because there's a major legal difference between a voluntary consent search and a search conducted under claimed legal authority. That distinction becomes important later, even if people don't understand it in the moment. And that's why calm wording matters so much. Not emotional wording, not aggressive wording, clear wording. I do not consent to any searches. Now, compare two drivers. The first hears K9 and panics instantly, talking nonstop, moving around, arguing emotionally, trying too hard to sound innocent. The second driver stays still, keeps hands visible, avoids unnecessary conversation, and calmly says, "I do not consent to any searches." Which driver looks more controlled? Which interaction stays calmer? Which situation is less likely to spiral emotionally? That difference matters more than people understand. Because traffic stops are heavily psychological. People think they're only legal events. They're not. They're behavioral events too. Every movement communicates something. Every sentence shifts the atmosphere slightly. Every emotional reaction affects the direction of the encounter. And once tension rises, logic usually falls. That's why preparation matters, not paranoia. Preparation. Knowing beforehand how you'll respond calmly under pressure instead of inventing reactions emotionally in real time. Because the worst roadside decisions usually happen in the first wave of panic after the unexpected occurs. And hearing "I'm calling a K9" absolutely counts as unexpected for most drivers. That's why the smartest thing you can do is surprisingly simple. Don't perform innocence. Don't argue law on the highway. Don't fill silence with nervous explanations. Stay calm, stay respectful. Keep movements minimal, and clearly say, "I do not consent to any searches." Because sometimes the biggest danger during a traffic stop isn't the dog. It's what fear convinces people to do before the dog even arrives.